Neat. Okay. Alrighty. Oop, microphone not working. All right, let's get started here. That's better. A little too loud. Okay. Alrighty. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so today I'm going to keep going talking about education. We should finish that and get started on work today. In terms of exams, okay, so exams, I was working on them yesterday. I'm pretty close to being done. I should be able to get done tomorrow. So yeah, tomorrow, I'm hopefully at the latest, you'll get your grades back tomorrow. And after that, we can, maybe during reading week or after reading week, if you want to come in and take a look, we can get you in to do that. If you have any questions about the exam, everything I think looks pretty good. For the most part, I'm not concerned. It looks pretty normal to me. Some of the questions are new, but none of them are tracking in overly negative directions. Everything looks pretty decent. Okay, so yes, stand by for that. I do have time to work on it like Tuesdays and Thursdays. Mondays and Wednesdays are a bit of a clown show for me, but I will get them done as soon as humanly possible. My son has swimming tonight, so I got an hour where I can sit by the pool, bored to tears, or marking your exams, or both. Okay, it does get long, honestly, reading like 50 answers to the same question. Not because your answers aren't good, but because you're good at answering questions by repeating the information I gave you in class. And so reading my own words back to me for the 50th time, is always fun. Okay, so happy Valentine's Day. It is also, in Catholicism, it is also Ash Wednesday today. So happy Valentine's Day, celebrate love. Also, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Or memento mori, remember that you will die. So, all of those things at the same time. And thinking about your own mortality, always a good thing. Okay, so we ended off, we were talking about, I guess we were talking about social class and education, right? And we ended kind of with the notion that when it comes to social class, higher income parents have more, capital, just in terms of money, social capital, cultural capital, all of which they pass on to their children. They tend to be more engaged, and they tend to pass on the value of education, especially higher ed, in considered ways to their kids, because ultimately they view it as, leading to their success. And so, they want their kids to succeed. So it's going to be like, stay in school, don't do drugs, all that fun stuff. Okay, so we ended off kind of, we're going to talk about credentialism. One of the things that starts, it starts with the baby boomers. It accelerates with Gen X, even more so with millennials, and it looks like it's going to be even more pronounced with Gen Z, is the fact that more and more people are going to university, right? Some kind of university or college program, 2 years or 4 years at the end of the day. And so what's ended up happening is what's called educational inflation, right? Basically, kind of like, I guess we all know this recently because we've lived through a period of monetary inflation, right? Your dollar's worth less today than it was 3 years ago. In the same way, right, we've gone through a period of, as more people get degrees, the degree that you have, the degree that you're earning, is worth less and less in the job market, right? It used to be that if you went back to the baby boomers, if you had a 4-year university degree, you were in the kind of social elite. Now, when something like 2/3 of the millennials and Gen Zers are going to have a university degree of some kind or a 2-year college degree, you're much less prestigious, right? To the point where, it's become, even for jobs that do not require, any kind of higher ed, a base kind of credential, to get a lot of entry-level jobs is some kind of post-secondary degree. The first job I had out of my bachelor's degree, between my bachelor's degree and my master's, I spent a little time working, was at, and I'll talk about this when we talk about work, but a little somewhat known company called Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Now, for reasons that I still cannot fathom, it makes no sense to me. Enterprise Rent-A-Car had a requirement that everybody who worked there had to have at least a 2-year, post-secondary degree, but with a strong preference for a 4-year undergraduate degree. Now, why? To this day, I cannot figure it out. I mean, basically, what did you do? You rented cars, so you put things into a form. You signed papers. In my case, you tried to sell the extra insurance with not very much passion and not very much success. It's like, do you want the extra insurance? No. Let's say I was never in the top tier of sellers at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I was just like, I'm gonna. Do you want the extra insurance? No, don't care. Okay. Anyway, but yeah, they required. Everybody who worked there, we all had undergraduate degrees. And basically what did we do is we rented cars, which was not hard, and we washed cars and picked people up in cars, which, wasn't hard, but was kind of annoying, especially when it gets down to like minus 25. So that's what we call educational inflation, right? More and more employers, more and more people have these degrees. And so what used to be covered by, say, a high school diploma, right? You could have gotten a decent, entry-level job out of high school with just your high school diploma. Now it's increasingly, an undergraduate degree that is that, right? The undergraduate degree has become what the high school diploma used to be for the baby bloomers. I need reading week now, please. My spoonerisms are getting worse. Okay, the baby boomers. Okay. So we also have a problem of what's called credentialism. And again, if you think of, back to our unit on generations, when we talked about Gen X and the shift that they had, towards developing a meaningful life philosophy and, the undergraduate degree or college education as a means of making money, and how they had shifted, right, more towards the making money side of things. What happens to the undergraduate degree as well is it goes from being sort of it goes to being just a credential, right? And increasingly just the base credential that you need, right? So why do most people go to university? Is it because they are passionate about learning, or they want to connect with the Western tradition of ideas, or not, or, typically not really anymore. The way most of us think of it now is as a credential, right? You need it so that you can get that job later on. But, a lot of students, I can say this because I teach like 1,200 students a year. Let's just say a lot of students aren't that passionate about the education portion. They're just here for the paper at the end of the day, right? C's get degrees, and that's all you need. And because what you're really after is that credential, and nobody really checks your grades afterwards anyway, unless you're going into grad school. So we've increasingly moved into education being just a way of getting a credential. Now, obviously, some credentials are more valuable than others, right? So where have we seen a shift? We've seen generally a shift into fields that are high paying, right? So, I mean, and again, here you have the kind of, this is the American Freshman Survey. When we got into Gen X, right, people went away from getting a college degree, incoming college students saying they went to college to make money versus to gain a general education and appreciation of ideas, right? And somewhere in Gen X, it's about it shifts to being about making money, and about gaining general ideas or a sense of the Western tradition or a sense of your society or any of those things, bettering yourself. All of that stuff kind of starts to decline below the idea of just making money, and that's where we get this kind of credentialism. Okay, so that was me testing if the Slido was working. Okay, so when it comes to kind of gendered patterns of work and education as well, there remain pretty strong gendered patterns in terms of what kind of education, especially higher education, that males and females seek out, right? So, I mean, feminists will argue that this is because of socialization, right? That basically women are socialized from very young into kind of caring and emotional labor kind of roles, and so they move into, and they're often tracked, say, by guidance counselors or the school system into these fields, right? So that, that early socialization will play into the career roles that people get, right? So the fact that women still kind of track into what are sometimes referred to as pink collar jobs, or sometimes called compassionate work, right? Things like teaching, nursing, and social work, feminists will argue is a function of socialization. There are counter arguments to this as well. And I mean, people who have done kind of the deep dive on economic analysis and looking at where people put their time, even in extremely egalitarian societies, have noted that, say in a society like Canada or the US, where things are relatively non-egalitarian by kind of developed country standards, you have a pretty marked skew in terms of things like the STEM fields, right? Science, technology, education, and math, which are roughly, especially in like math and engineering, 80% male, 20% female. But when you go to, a very egalitarian country, somewhere like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, where social attitudes about gender roles are actually much more egalitarian even than say Canada, you actually get that skew is worse. It's about for engineering, it's about 90% male to 10% female. So the counter argument is that women are just more interested in these kind of compassionate or pink collar types of fields. So that's where they kind of end up because of their natural inclinations, right? Because that's what's interesting to them, and especially if you're looking at, say, the argument that Bibby makes, because they're more interested in interpersonal relationships rather than kinetics or spatial type of tasks. And again, I think both sides have a sort of a point here. When it comes to young women, right, young women continue generally, although this is shifting broadly with Gen Z a little bit, to put a higher focus on marriage and family than men. And sometimes, we'll end up choosing careers that match those expectations, especially, teaching is a big one here, because you get sort of summers off, right? A lot of women will go into teaching as a profession that matches the kind of family schedule, right? If your kids are going to be off during the summer, it's obviously helpful to be off yourself. Okay. The general trend in higher ed, I guess secondary and higher ed, is towards more women completing programs. And it depends on where you're looking at more kind of like, we'd call like a comprehensive universities like U of A, because they have, big programs in STEM. It's a little bit more balanced. It's somewhere around, 55 to 60% of the graduates being women, and 40 to 45% being male. When you look at, say, liberal arts colleges, so if you went to somewhere that only offers really liberal arts programs and has kind of minimal kind of STEM programs, the split gets much more pronounced. It's usually, around 2/3 of graduates are women and 1/3 are men. And in extreme cases, right, with certain liberal arts colleges, especially in the US, you can see a split as much as 70% of the graduates being female and 30% being male. So there's a big disproportion in terms of who is earning undergraduate degrees. And today, a much larger proportion of women in Canada hold undergraduate degrees as compared to men. This has contributed, I'm trying to think if that's on my next slide. No, okay, let me go through this actually. Women earn today more graduate degrees than men do. Now, it's worth noting there too, the fields in which they earn those graduate degrees, again, do tend towards the social sciences and humanities. Men still earn more PhDs in science, engineering, and math. But if you go to something like sociology, sociology, psychology, in terms of master's PhDs, you're looking at depending on where you are, again, a split either about 2/3 of the graduates are women, and in some cases up to about 80% of the graduates in kind of humanities, social sciences for graduate level programs are women. So it is a big chunk. Still earning, overwhelmingly women still go into careers in teaching, nursing, and social work and still earn, their PhDs and masters in fields related to those, education, healthcare to some extent, and social sciences, humanities, and those types of fields. And generally, one of the reasons that this ends up being, I don't want to say a problem, but ends up being talked about is because people who go into those kind of fields end up in positions that tend to be non-scalable, right? There's only so much teaching at a master's or PhD level you can do as compared to inventing a brand new computer chip or widget or program. And so women who go into those fields tend to see less financial reward than their male counterparts who get, say, a master's or PhD in STEM fields. Women today make up about 57%, and I've seen as high, depending on where you are, 66% of new medical doctors, right? So MDs, women are making up larger proportions of medical doctors. Again, being an MD is kind of in that sort of compassionate field kind of range, right? Healthcare. A lot have made the jump from, say, nursing into kind of medical doctor degrees, where people used to go into just nursing. Now they go into medicine completely and get MDs. So there's that shift. And we're seeing a much bigger proportion of new doctors being women. Now, again, there's arguments that some of the fields they go into, they're less likely to go into surgery, like to be surgeons, which is one of the higher paid fields. And so there's some other specialities that women are less likely to go into, and they tend to track towards things like neurology, pediatrics, and obstetrics, right? So, or general medicine, right? Because again, they want to have families. They don't want to wait until they're like, I can't remember how long it takes to do an MD, like 42 before they are out of school and able to kind of justify having kids. So a lot stay in general medicine as well, which, as doctors go, is the lowest paid part of medicine. And about 40% of new law graduates are women. This has been kind of tracking upward, and I suspect it'll cross the kind of 50% boundary. That said, even in the law, women are far less likely to, say, make partner at a law firm. They tend to work really hard until they're about in their 30s, and then a lot of women will think about having a family, have kids, 1 or 2 or 3, probably not more than that. And usually then they don't go back to working the long hours it takes to be a partner at a law firm. So lots of women graduating in the law, but still relatively few women making partner in the law. Okay, so I sigh because I've always been a little cool to this argument, right? It's pretty clear for a long time that boys have been performing worse in school than their female peers, right? And that, you've had a desistance of men attending universities, right? We've seen drops in male attendance rates. And there's a whole host of kind of potential social problems that are affecting men in particular. Young men are dropping out of the workforce. They make up a big part of, say, like the opioid crisis and the drug crisis in ways that are relatively new. They're not pursuing higher ed at as high of rates, and if any part of the population is sort of dropping out of higher ed, especially in the liberal arts, it's young men. But I've always been a little bit cool to the sort of like boys are in trouble, a crisis of boys, specifically because, right, when you look at kind of lifelong outcomes, men still tend to economically outperform women over time. Now that said, if you remove like the top 5% of men from the equation, right? So like the super high earners, amongst men, and you take them out, like you control out for them, young men and boys are doing considerably worse educationally and economically than their female peers, right? And it's been trending this way really since the 1990s. And it looks like, at that top end where you have men, in that top 5%, where you have men making, in the millions of dollars, it sort of drags up the average considerably. So like men still economically outperform women, especially once you kind of get into the childbearing years for women. Women's economic performance drops considerably as they drop out of the workforce to take care of young children or take time off or whatever it looks like. That said, it seems pretty clear to me now that there is something going on with young men, right? And that there is a kind of negative trend in terms of men performing well economically, educationally, and life outcomes, all sorts of things like, how good of jobs they get, the number of university degrees they're getting. And once we get into sex, their kind of formation of long-term relationships is definitely something that's kind of in decline. So there's lots of problems afflicting boys, and I've been kind of resistant to it for a long time. I read this book. It's interesting, but I was never entirely convinced by it. But increasingly, right, and it's a really interesting book, but I was never entirely convinced by it. But it does seem to be, in the long-term trends, especially in educational performance, a kind of slow degradation of male educational performance, especially in the long term, right? How many degrees they're getting, how long they stay in university, whether they attend university at all. Now, I mean, Leonard Sachs, very famously blames a bunch of things, video games and prescription drugs in particular, right? Things like the fact that boys are more likely to be coded as ADHD, although that's flipping too. And given, things like Ritalin and Vyvanse and all of these stimulants, made to feel kind of pathologized. Anyway, I could talk about this book. The environmental toxins one has always been an interesting one for me, particularly plastics. But that's a case for a different time and definitely worth reading the book. But yeah, there does seem to be, I don't want to say a crisis of masculinity, but certainly a poor performance for boys in lots of fields. And I was just reading a piece by someone I genuinely respect in terms of the social science, which is Jonathan Haidt, who highlighted the fact that in terms of fields like psychology, so people who go on to become therapists, men have almost completely exited that kind of academic field, the academic fields that lead there. So there's definitely something going on. I don't want to be too definitive about it. I'm just sort of like slowly turning my opinion towards, this is probably a problem that we should look at, and that there may be something going on in terms of boys being left behind, educationally and economically. And, in terms of romance and forming a decent life. Oh, that was my last slide. Okay. Well, class dismissed. No, I'm kidding. I have another set of slides. I'm sorry. Let's talk about work. I even had them ready. But as usual, if I get to the end of a slideshow, my computer forgets that it's connected to a projector. Okay. Let's talk about youth in the labor market. All right, it's always a fun one. Okay, so youth in the labor market. Ooh, new Slido. Hopefully that one works. All righty. So, starting in the 1980s, right? So we talked about, when we talked about our unit on the generations, right? We talked about the baby boomers as being this generation that succeeded beyond its wildest expectations, right? that basically they came into a marketplace where, the economy was growing at, 4, 5, sometimes 6%, GDP growth per year. The economy was booming. The United States and Canada were supplying goods to the rest of the world that was still rebuilding after the Second World War, right? And basically all the major economies of Europe and Japan had all kind of been destroyed by the war, right? So the baby boomers did really, really well, and basically benefited from the huge boom in manufacturing. Now, starting in the 1970s, a couple of things happened that really, really cooled down the economy and make the lives of specifically Gen X, but every generation after that, a little bit worse economically, right? And no one will perform like the baby boomers, especially at such an early age, right? So they gain wealth, much quicker in their lives than any other generation that comes after them. Okay, so what happens, right, is you get a couple of things. So by the 1970s, under the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Japan, the U.S. has basically financed the reconstruction of most of the industrial economies of Western Europe and then certainly of Japan. So you start to get more competition, in terms of the provision of especially industrial goods, right? So a lot of the jobs that used to exist in the United States that were really good manufacturing jobs, right? You graduate from high school. I was trying to think of the name of a high school, but I couldn't. Hubert Humphrey High, right? In Dearborn, Michigan, and you go down to the Ford factory and you talk to the foreman, and he says, yeah, you can start on the assembly line tomorrow. And then, with your new job in hand, you go and you get married to your high school sweetheart, buy a house and start having kids, right? That broadly ends by the beginning of the 1970s, right? Manufacturing in the US, partially driven by the union movement, gets much, much more expensive, right? There's cheaper sources of labor in places like starting in Japan, and eventually, by the 1980s, they'll start to expand into China, and then Taiwan, South Korea, and other places in the Far East where labor is far cheaper. So a lot of those jobs start to kind of slowly disappear as globalization sort of picks up. The other thing that happens is a lot of those jobs, right, as the economy slows, you're not seeing it, you kind of go down to a GDP growth of between 1 and 3% annually. So the kind of growth rate of the economy roughly halves in the 1970s. So, and you get a bunch of recessions that hit as well, where it's negative GDP growth. So the economy slows down, which means not as many new jobs are being created. And what you have is basically that huge generation of baby boomers has already, by the 1970s, mostly moved into the workforce. And it gluts the workforce, right? There's so many baby boomers in the workforce, and they're already established, they already have experience, that it leaves very little room for the Gen X and even millennials to get into the job market in good paying jobs, right? The baby boomers are such a large demographic that they just hold in the economy forever. And along with that, right, you get a bunch of economic crises in the early 1970s, right? You get sort of the beginnings of the collapse of sort of the welfare state system. Basically the welfare state has become way too expensive. All of the promises that were made, in the 1940s and 50s, all the social welfare programs, Medicare, Social Security, like pensions and healthcare, all become really expensive, and governments start to pare back on what government can do. So a lot of jobs that used to exist in government as entry-level jobs sort of disappear as well. And what this does is it basically, one more economic thing, because it's important. Governments have been spending so much money that it also drives, two more things. It also drives the rate of inflation crazy, right? The period of the 1970s is often referred to as the period of stagflation, because it's a period of economic stagnation and a period of runaway inflation, right? So what happens is governments responding to runaway inflation. The other thing is the runaway inflation is also driven by a crisis in the Middle East, what's called the Arab oil embargoes. Basically, the big oil producing nations, OPEC, cut oil production and send less oil to the West, specifically because they're pissed off about the way the West is supporting Israel, and it drives the price of energy way up. So you get runaway, I know, it all sounds very familiar, because apparently history moves in cycles. So what you get is runaway inflation in the US, Canada, and across Western Europe. And so what governments do in response to this is they raise interest rates. And they raise interest rates a lot. If you think interest rates in Canada today are high, if you go back to the 1970s, you're talking about sometimes the base interest rate from the Bank of Canada being somewhere between 15 and 20%, right? So things like car loans, home loans, bank loans for businesses, all are running at, between 18 and 22% interest, which means the economy just grinds to a halt in the 1970s. And it's a really bad time. People who lived through it, my parents were, my dad was kind of coming into his late 20s, early 30s at the time. And things like, in the 1970s, you could only buy, based on your plate number on your car, you could only buy gas on certain days of the week. And there were lineups at gas stations that were, an hour or two long as people tried to gas up their vehicles. So all sorts of economic headwinds coming right at that cohort of Gen X that's going to start coming into the workplace at the end of the 1970s. So they come into an economy where what they experience is what they call McJobs, right? A lot of those good, high-paying career path jobs that were open to the previous generations are no longer there for Generation X, right? So they end up in these McJobs, right? These service industry jobs at the kind of bottom tier of the kind of the economy, right? With not a lot of potential. You are sort of a cog in a machine, right? You are a replaceable part. And these are not jobs that people tend to want to build careers in, right? You're put in, and I mean, I'll tell you, I already told you I worked at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. It's very much this type of job for me, right? And I'm like on the cusp of Gen X and millennials. You put into a kind of system, right? Where you just do what is expected of you in that workplace, even to the point where your interactions with people are scripted. So you get, Gen X, right? We saw more of them getting a post-secondary education, but coming out and getting less economic benefit, especially at first. All right, yes, this was this picture's old now, because that vehicle is like a very old Chevy Suburban. This was my McJob when I came out of school, right? And that's very much the experience I had, was coming out into a workplace that was very much not a lot of opportunity for, someone with a bachelor's degree in social science, right? Not a lot of opportunities. So I went and took a job at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I bought a suit. I washed cars in a suit. It was awesome. It was horrible. Possibly the worst 3 years of my life. Having to be at work at 5:30 every morning to wash cars and, vacuum out cars or deodorize cars that people had smoked weed in is an enduring kind of pain in my life that will never heal. And yet I still rent from Enterprise Rent-A-Car because they're cheap. So there you go. Also, I know how to manipulate them because I've been on the inside, so I can always get like free rental days. And I'm like, yeah, kind of smelled like weed in here. And they're like, oh, what can we do to make it better? It's like, if you could take 2 days off the rental, that'd be amazing. Like, of course, sir. Oh, so easy when you know what they do on the inside. And like, honestly, if they get a bad customer service score, they get talked to by their manager, like, because they might send you a survey and you fill out the survey. And if you say anything less than completely satisfied, they're getting a talking to from managers. Because I got that talk like every week. I was a terrible employee. They should not have kept me employed for 3 years. And I think the only reason was because I type really fast. So it was like, I was the fastest at filling out the contracts. This guy could like do a contract at Enterprise Rent-A-Car in about 45 seconds, including like taking the information off someone's driver's license. So I could, especially like the crunch times at like early in the morning when people drop off their car at the body shop, or at night when everybody's getting their car for like the weekend on Friday, I could write like, in 10 minutes, I could write like 15 contracts. And so that made me an invaluable employee, and they really should not have kept me around because I had the worst attitude. I was just the worst. I was a very unpleasant employee. I also made them, when they were going for coffee runs and they wanted to go to Tim Hortons, I forced them to go to Starbucks because I was like, no, I want good coffee. I work at this shitty job. You better give me good coffee. Anyway, you could probably, if you could find my boss, you could interview him, and I'm sure he's still scarred by my terrible attitude. Okay, anyway. So we talk about the economy. Aggregate economic conditions, right? So the macroeconomic conditions, right? Whether you're in a recession or a boom, will tend to affect young people the most, right? Young workers have the least amount of experience, right? And so they are the most expendable workers. So they're typically the first let go. Now that isn't always 100% true. There are economic moments where, companies do want to let older workers go, specifically because older workers tend to be a lot more expensive, but they're also a lot more competent and they carry a bunch of institutional knowledge and social capital. So especially in really high paying professions, older workers will tend to be kept around much more than young workers, because it's like, okay, well, when we have money, we can hire another, first year engineer. They're a dime a dozen, but this person, and I have friends who own businesses, like, we absolutely have to keep this person, even though he's making $200,000 a year, and it's our biggest expense because he just knows how to do everything, right? So younger workers will tend to see turnover and churn rates in the economy much more than older workers. During economic downturns, right, you get less hiring of new employees. Obviously, during downsizing, right, you don't get as many new jobs created. And even internships, right, tend to decline during economic downturns. I had a friend, he's now, I think, sold it, but he ran an engineering company and he used to have co-op students. And then 2015 hit, right, and he had been having co-op students up until 2015. Then the price of oil went down, all his business dried up. And he kept getting asked by the engineering school here, like, would you take like a co-op student? He's like, no, I have nothing for them to do, right? I don't even have enough for my paid staff to do. What am I going to get an unpaid co-op student to do? So even during downturns, right, internships and those kind of entry-level opportunities tend to evaporate. That's loud. Okay, I'm doing good for time. All right, so entitlement. One of the things, and this especially was true with older millennials, right? So those millennials born more towards the beginning of the millennial cohort, right? So like in the early 1980s, when they were coming into the workforce kind of in the mid 2000s, so, right around 2003, 2005, you saw this discourse pop up. And it's never really gone away. Gen Z has also been faced with this. I was just listening to a podcast the other day, and they were, there was two Gen Xers complaining about how millennials, and I'm like, you're not even talking about millennials. Get your generations right. You're talking about Gen Z at this point. But how millennials are so lazy and entitled, and they don't want to do the 8 a.m. work or meeting because they have a workout schedule. And I'm like, okay, just slightly younger than Boomer. That doesn't sound as good. Well, they're definitely Gen Xers. Right, so the thing that happened with millennials, especially as they're coming into the workforce, they were perceived as lazy, right? And the baby boomers and Gen Xers that were already in the workforce, and again, this is still hanging around in the discourse, we're like, millennials are so lazy, right? And especially, they perceived that millennials wanted, essentially all the benefits of working for a long time, like economic pay, vacations, and work-life balance, good wages from the start, right? And this was seen as entitlement, right? Principally, this is a kind of cultural attitude. The boomers especially had come into the workforce at a time where it was like, you climb the ladder, you pay your debts, you work an enormous amount when you're young, and then you get the benefits out when you're a little older. Now, for them, obviously, they worked really hard in their 20s and then got a lot of the economic benefits in their 30s. For millennials, it's a little different. They worked really hard in their 20s and 30s, and the economic benefit isn't until their 40s, right, because of some of the weird delays. So millennials were seen as entitled. Again, this is held with Gen Z as well. I guess with Gen Z, you also get the fact that they're snowflakes being added to the kind of mix. Now, the position has little merit. Like, anyone who's done an economic kind of analysis or, talk to millennials about what they want in work, what they're willing to do, suggests that this isn't actually what millennials believe. Millennials had, certain phrases that they were really, I don't want to say addicted to, but one that they repeated a lot things like they wanted work-life balance, which was reacted to really poorly by older workers, right? And especially at the beginning, right, as millennials are getting into the workplace, it gets a little bit better, as they get older, and like we saw with Twenge, once you hit your kind of late 30s, early 40s as a millennial, you'll tend to outperform older generations in some ways. But early on, like when they're getting into the workforce, broadly speaking, their wages declined relative to inflation and the wages of older workers. Okay, no questions? No questions. Okay. Broad patterns, like we talk about employment. One of the things that Twenge pointed out, right, is that fewer Gen Z youth are working as compared to older generations, right? So, I mean, if we look at it, and these are numbers from 2018, and I wasn't able to find any more updated numbers, only 18% of Gen Z, and this comes from Pew Research, so it's a solid research firm, 18% of Gen Zers in 2018, so those 15 to 17, were employed in 2018, compared to when they were the same age, 27% of millennials and 41% of Gen Xers, right? So youth employment patterns are definitely trending downward. There's no real question of that. And this is a kind of general trend, right? We'll see this with dating, right? Fewer Gen Zers are dating, fewer Gen Zers are doing a lot of things that used to be markers of kind of emerging adulthood, right? So Gen Zers, right, are just shifting to an even slower life plan, right? Gen X was, short childhood, long adolescence. Millennials were kind of the same, and Gen Zers are more like long childhood, long adolescence. So it's a really, really slow life plan. Okay, yeah, among these emerging adults or young adults, right, 62% of Gen Zers, so 18 to 22, were employed in 2018 compared to 71% of millennials when they were that age, and 79% of Gen Xers, right? So general trend is towards less and less young people working. Now, again, there are obvious generational differences, right? Fewer Gen Xers were taking post-secondary degrees as compared to Gen Z, right? So more of them were going straight into the workplace with just a high school diploma. So it kind of makes sense, especially in that second demographic. And millennials and Gen Z is not a huge difference in terms of how many people attend university. But for whatever reason, 9% more of them were working at that age. Okay. So if you want to talk millennials and Gen Z, where do they want to work, right? Top 10 in-demand jobs, for Gen Zers. Number 1 is software engineer, right? And everything other than that is kind of single digits. So working in a kind of service industry, especially in tech, highly prized. So top jobs for Gen Z in terms of what they want to do, and then percent of Gen Z applications, for firms that are looking for jobs. Median salary for open jobs, right? Now, this may not all be entry-level jobs, right? Because I doubt even an entry-level software engineering job is paying you $100,000 US right out of the gate. So that's just, there's 60,000 open jobs, and the median wage is about 100,000. Okay, top employers attracting Gen Z workers. So where are Gen Z workers ending up, and millennials, like where are they being attracted to in terms of the firms that are hiring them? Not surprisingly, right, the top ones are all tech firms, right? IBM, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Salesforce for Gen Z. Deloitte, which I guess is a financial firm. And then for millennials, right, Amazon, IBM. I'm actually surprised to see IBM so high on this list. Sort of the gray lady of tech firms, like it's old and kind of boring. But you see, right, the growth part of the economy is really in tech, and that's where both millennials and Gen Z are ultimately gravitating to. Now, Amazon is not entirely clear. Are they working for Amazon on the tech side, or are they delivery drivers or warehouse workers? That's another question that I couldn't find in this particular Glassdoor economic research study. But a lot of these jobs, right, are in tech, at least to some degree. Man, Gen Z is working at Lockheed Martin, right? Like major weapons manufacturer. So, y'all are driving the war. Shame on you. No, I'm kidding. All right, what do young people want, right? In terms of millennials and Gen Z, what do they want out of work? Like, what are the top things that they say that they're interested in? So millennials, right, and Gen Z both appear to value work environment, right? They both want a great work environment to be in. For millennials, right, great people, great benefits, life balance are all key. For millennials, or sorry, Gen Z, flexible hours, good pay, great people, flexible schedule are in the top. Now I can say this, like we did some interviews, we were looking for a study coordinator in the Center for Criminological Research, and every applicant we had, and it was hilarious actually, because you could almost predict it. They're like, it's like, do you have any questions for us? And it's like, would you describe this as like a 9-to-5 job, right? And how many days on average would I be able to work from home? And we were, my boss, who's definitely Gen X and German. So I don't know if that's important, but she has this very like blunt affect, which is hilarious. And I love Sandra. She's the best. And then me, older millennial. And we're just like, it's a weird question to ask. And then like the other person who was interviewing with us is an even older Gen Xer. And we're all just like looking at each other like, that's a weird question. But it's not for Gen Z, right? Gen Z, flexible hours, work-life balance, or not work-life balance, flexible schedules are really, really important. And I guess work environment, your house in your pajamas is probably the best work environment of all if you're Gen Z. Okay. What they don't want, what they say they don't want. Sorry, I flipped these, so now they're inverted. Gen Z is over here and millennials are there. Gen Z doesn't want to work long hours. They don't want to work for low pay. Hey, who does? Minimum wage, right? Definitely don't want to work. Or rude customers. I get it. I face my share of rude customers. They're terrible. I much more enjoy being a professor because like I have all the power. It's like the customer's always right, except when they're a student, in which case they're wrong whenever I say they are, which I love. No, I'm joking, of course, but it is a really much different power dynamic than people being in, I drive a Chevy Tahoe. I want a Chevy Tahoe. I'm like, I don't have a Chevy Tahoe. I have this Dodge Durango. I hate Dodge. Fuck, it's going to be one of those days. Anyway, that was, like I said, deep scars from my time at Enterprise Work, rent a car. Deep scars. I think for millennials, what's interesting, right, and I totally resonate with this, the things they don't want is a lot of upper management. I hate upper management. To this day, I hate upper management. I cannot stand, bureaucratic types who don't know what they're doing telling me how to do my job. I work in a big bureaucratic institution, so we fight with this a lot. Low pay, obviously, millennials don't want low pay. They want life balance, so they don't want cons for millennials. Poor life balance, I'm assuming, is how this question is asked, because I assume, given what I know about millennials, that they want good work-life balance, and they want a good work environment, good work hours, right? Okay, so those things are what are important to them. 2 minutes. I can do this slide in 2 minutes, and then we'll go. All right, what millennials want versus what Gen Z wants. Millennials want to work towards a purpose. Gen Z wants money and job security. You are the children of Gen X, I'm sorry. More interested in ongoing conversations than annual assessments. I also hate annual assessments. Need frequent feedback on their performance. This plays into the kind of anxiety, I think, and of Gen Z that always wants to know how they're doing. I suspect that's what's there. Interested in collaboration and teamwork. Driven by individual performance and competition. You hate each other, and that's okay. And view career as one of the most important things in their life. And then Gen Z prioritize healthy work-life balance. Yeah, I heard that before. Until you get into your 30s, and then it's like, oh shit, I need to make some money. Anyway, that's kind of the priorities and where they stand. I don't want to denigrate. If you're like, I want a good work-life balance, I'm like, yeah, I wanted that too. And today I hold 4 jobs at the same time. I don't know how that happened. All right, why don't we leave it there? Because we're 1 minute and there's a lot of text on this slide. We'll pick that up on Friday. Perfect way to go into reading week with a slide that has just a wall of text on it. So we'll see you then. I have not had a question slide in ages. All right, there we go. Okay, all right. Stream.